On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's sense of distance from war. In a matter of hours, the Pacific was no longer a vast protective ocean, it was a battlefield. Across thousands of miles of water, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved with calculated speed. Within months, Japanese forces swept through Micronesia, seized the Gilbert Islands, occupied Wake, Guam, and pressed deep into Southeast Asia. Their strategy was bold and simple: build a defensive perimeter so wide that the United States would never be able to push back. By early 1942, that perimeter looked nearly impenetrable. Japanese bases dotted the Central Pacific like stepping stones, forming a shield of airfields and naval anchorages. Long-range bombers and patrol aircraft extended their surveillance arcs over open water, watching for any sign of an American counterattack. The Pacific, once a highway for commerce, had become a guarded fortress. And yet, hidden far to the south of the main Japanese strongholds lay a thin necklace of coral islands known as the Ellis Islands. Today, they are part of Tuvalu, but in 1942 they were remote, underdeveloped, and strategically ambiguous. Among them was Funafuti Atoll, a narrow ring of coral barely 400 meters wide in places, surrounding a calm lagoon. It had no port facilities, no airstrip, no modern infrastructure. Coconut palms, scrub brush, and loose coral defined its landscape. It was so small that from the air it seemed like a white scratch on a blue canvas. To Japanese planners focused on major naval routes and resource-rich territories, Funafuti barely registered. It posed no immediate threat. It lacked the capacity to support aircraft or ships. There were no heavy guns, no fortifications, no reason to waste men or material occupying it. In a war measured by fleets and divisions, Funafuti appeared irrelevant. But wars are not won only by what seems important at first glance. They are won by foresight. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, American strategists were studying maps with a different perspective. After the shock of December 1941, the United States needed a way to strike back. Aircraft carriers offered mobility, but they were few in number and constantly at risk. What the Pacific demanded were forward airfields, stepping stones that would allow heavy bombers to leapfrog across the ocean. The problem was geography. The distances were enormous. From Hawaii to the Japanese-held Gilbert Islands was too far for sustained bombing operations without intermediate bases. The United States needed airstrips closer to enemy territory, positioned just outside Japan's defensive perimeter. And when planners examined the map carefully, the Ellis Islands began to stand out. Funafuti's location was subtle but powerful. It sat south of the Gilberts, within range of Japanese installations if equipped with long runways. It offered a lagoon that could shelter ships from open seas. Most importantly, it was unoccupied by Japanese forces. That meant it could be taken and fortified before the enemy realized its value. American reconnaissance flights confirmed what maps suggested. The atoll was fragile but usable. Survey teams noted the coral composition of the ground, hard in places, powdery in others. There were no mountains to level, but there was also no solid soil. Building anything substantial would require reshaping the island itself. At the same time, the United States was reorganizing its construction capabilities. In March 1942, the Navy formally created the Construction Battalions, soon nicknamed the Seabees from the initials CB. These were not ordinary laborers. They were electricians, engineers, heavy equipment operators, steel workers, men recruited for skill as much as strength. Their unofficial motto would become "can do," but in the summer of 1942, they were still an experiment. Strategic urgency accelerated decisions. The Battle of Midway had halted Japanese expansion, but it had not broken their perimeter. To carry the fight westward, the U.S. needed air power within reach of enemy bases. That meant building airstrips in places previously considered unbuildable. In August and September of 1942, as Marines fought desperately on Guadalcanal, orders were quietly issued for the occupation and fortification of Funafuti. Naval forces moved south, landing troops to secure the atoll without resistance. Soon after, ships carrying construction equipment followed: bulldozers, graders, trucks, steel planking, fuel drums, generators. Everything had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean. When the first Seabees arrived in October 1942, they did not find a base. They found a strip of coral and palm trees. The heat was relentless. Fresh water was scarce. The ground shifted under heavy boots. There were no roads, no foundations, no warehouses. Every nail, every plank, every gallon of fuel had to be landed over reefs and hauled by hand or tractor. And always there was the clock. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft could discover the buildup at any time. Submarines prowled Pacific shipping lanes. If Japan chose to strike before construction was complete, Funafuti could become a trap instead of a stronghold. Engineers surveyed the land and faced a brutal calculation. To support heavy bombers like the B-24 Liberator, they would need a runway long and strong enough to handle tens of thousands of pounds of aircraft weight. But the island itself was barely wide enough. Coral would have to be crushed and compacted. Steel Marsden matting would need to be laid across unstable ground. Drainage systems would have to be improvised to prevent tropical rains from turning the surface into sludge. It was an audacious idea: transform a fragile coral atoll into a fortress capable of projecting air power hundreds of miles north into enemy territory. From Tokyo's perspective, Funafuti was still insignificant. From Washington's perspective, it was a lever. If properly built, it could pry open the Gilbert Islands. It could support reconnaissance flights, bombing raids, naval operations. It could become a stepping stone in the larger strategy that would later be known as island hopping. The men standing on that coral strip in October 1942 could not yet see the future battles their runway would enable. They only saw palm trees to clear, coral to crush, and a horizon filled with uncertainty. But history often pivots on such overlooked places. The question hanging over Funafuti was not whether it was small. It was whether small could be decisive. In a war defined by vast fleets and global strategy, could a 400-meter-wide ring of coral be turned into a weapon powerful enough to shift the balance of the Pacific? The answer would depend not on admirals or generals alone, but on engineers with bulldozers, steel planks, and an impossible deadline. By the time the Seabees began serious construction on Funafuti in late 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. The United States was no longer fighting simply to survive, it was preparing to advance. But advance required infrastructure, and infrastructure required something Funafuti did not naturally possess: stability. At first glance, coral looks solid. It glitters white under the sun, hard enough to cut bare feet. But beneath the surface, a coral atoll is a fragile skeleton, porous, uneven, and unpredictable. Heavy aircraft could not simply land on it. A fully loaded B-24 Liberator weighed more than 60,000 pounds. If the runway shifted, cracked, or collapsed, the consequences would be catastrophic. There would be no second chances on a strip barely wider than a city block. The Seabees began by clearing the island. Coconut palms were felled, roots ripped from the ground, brush burned away. Bulldozers, unloaded by crane from cargo ships and dragged across reefs, pushed coral into windrows. Surveyors paced out measurements in the blinding sun, marking the line where the runway would stretch almost the entire length of the atoll. Every foot of ground had to be tested. Every soft pocket had to be reinforced. The key was coral itself. If the island was made of it, they would weaponize it. Seabees crushed coral rock into aggregate, grinding it down and spreading it in layers.
Water trucks dampened the surface, rollers compacted it repeatedly, compressing loose fragments into a hardened base. It was primitive compared to mainland airfield construction, but there was no mainland here, only ingenuity. Yet coral alone was not enough. The surface needed reinforcement to withstand the pounding of bomber landings. That solution came in the form of perforated steel planking, Marsden matting, also known as PSP. Sheets of interlocking steel, punched with holes to reduce weight and improve traction, were laid across the compacted coral. Piece by piece, panel by panel, the runway began to take shape. The metallic clatter of steel echoed across the lagoon. Every shipment of matting, fuel drums, and machinery had to cross thousands of miles of ocean vulnerable to Japanese submarines. Cargo ships moved in convoys when possible, zigzagging to avoid torpedoes. At Funafuti, landing supplies was its own battle. Coral reefs prevented large ships from docking directly. Materials were offloaded onto smaller craft, ferried ashore, and manhandled through sand and heat. There were no established piers; those had to be built too. Meanwhile, the tropical climate tested both men and machines. Engines overheated, salt air corroded exposed metal, sudden downpours transformed freshly graded coral into slick, unstable slurry. Mosquitoes swarmed at dusk. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully, collected from rainfall and stored in tanks. Disease was an ever-present threat: dysentery, skin infections, exhaustion. This was construction under siege by environment alone. And then there was the enemy. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft occasionally probed the region, and the possibility of air raids was constant. Anti-aircraft guns were emplaced even before the runway was finished. Radar installations were assembled as quickly as possible to provide early warning. The irony was stark. Men building an airfield had to defend it before it could defend itself. Despite the pressure, progress accelerated. The Seabees worked in rotating shifts, sometimes around the clock. Floodlights illuminated the runway at night, casting long shadows over steel panels and coral dust. Equipment operators learned to improvise repairs with limited spare parts. If a grater broke down, it was cannibalized for components. If fuel ran low, schedules were adjusted. There was no hardware store, no supply depot beyond what arrived by sea. As the runway extended, parallel projects sprang up across the atoll. Fuel tank farms were constructed, their storage drums arranged and camouflaged to reduce visibility from the air. Ammunition dumps were dug into reinforced positions. Quonset huts rose in neat rows to house personnel. Communication lines were strung between command posts and gun batteries. A fragile strip of coral was being transformed into an operational base. One of the most delicate calculations involved runway length. Engineers needed enough distance for heavy bombers to take off safely, particularly in tropical heat that reduced engine performance. But space was limited. The atoll narrowed in places, forcing creative grading and shoreline reinforcement. In some sections, coral fill was pushed outward to widen the usable surface. The ocean was only yards on either side. A slight miscalculation during landing could send an aircraft skidding into water. Time remained the ultimate adversary. Intelligence reports indicated increasing Japanese defensive preparations in the Gilbert Islands. If Funafuti was to serve as a staging ground for future operations, it had to be operational soon. Every delay risked losing strategic momentum. The breakthrough came when the runway's surface finally met operational standards. Compacted coral base, steel matting locked in place, drainage channels carved to divert tropical rains. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. It didn't need to be permanent. It only needed to hold long enough to project power northward. The first landings were tense. Engines roared over the lagoon as aircraft approached low over palm tops. Wheels struck steel with a metallic shriek, tires gripping perforated panels. For a moment, the entire experiment balanced on compressed coral and faith. Then the aircraft rolled to a stop. The runway held. With that landing, Funafuti ceased to be a remote atoll. It became a node in a growing network of forward bases pushing toward Japanese territory. The Seabees had proven something essential. Terrain was not destiny. Even the most fragile environment could be reshaped by planning, labor, and steel. But success did not mean safety. Now that the airfield was functional, it would inevitably draw attention. Bombers would soon lift off from this coral strip toward enemy-held islands, and once they did, Funafuti would no longer be invisible on Japanese maps. What had begun as an engineering gamble was becoming a strategic provocation. A 400-meter ring of coral was turning into a runway of consequence, one that could carry the war northward, closer to the heart of Japanese Pacific defenses.
By early 1943, Funafuti was no longer a construction site hidden at the edge of the Pacific. It was alive with aircraft engines, radio chatter, and the constant tension of anticipation. The runway that had once been a vision sketched onto coral now shimmered under tropical sun, lined with steel matting and edged by sandbags and gun pits. And with the arrival of operational bomber squadrons, the atoll crossed an invisible threshold. It had become a target. The first long-range bombers to stage through Funafuti were consolidated B-24 Liberators, four-engine heavy bombers capable of flying vast distances over open ocean. Their presence changed everything. Each aircraft required fuel, ammunition, maintenance crews, spare parts, and secure parking areas. What had been a fragile experiment in engineering now had to function as a living, breathing war machine. The sound defined daily life. Engines warming at dawn, the metallic hammering of repairs, the dull thud of anti-aircraft practice fire. Even at night, the atoll was rarely silent. Radar operators scanned the skies from makeshift installations, watching for unidentified blips. Lookouts studied the horizon for the silhouette of submarines. War had come not with a dramatic invasion, but with constant vigilance. Japanese forces soon took notice. Reconnaissance aircraft began probing the area, flying high and fast to photograph the growing base. The mere presence of bombers within range of the Gilbert Islands was a strategic threat. Anti-aircraft batteries were expanded, their crews drilled relentlessly. Camouflage nets were stretched over fuel dumps and aircraft revetments. Palm fronds were arranged to break up the outline of installations from above. Funafuti had to look smaller than it was. Then came the air raids. Japanese bombers struck intermittently, often at night, attempting to disrupt operations and damage the runway. Searchlights stabbed at the sky as sirens wailed across the narrow strip of land. Men dove into foxholes carved into coral. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their tracers arcing upward in fiery lines. Explosions sent fountains of sand and coral fragments into the air. On an island only a few hundred meters wide, there was nowhere truly safe. Damage was inevitable. Craters scarred sections of the runway, shrapnel tore through equipment, fuel drums ignited in brief infernos before being contained. But the Seabees' work had been built with redundancy in mind. Repair crews moved out as soon as raids ended, filling craters with crushed coral, relaying steel matting, restoring operational capability often within hours. The base could not afford downtime. Every day mattered. Life on Funafuti became a study in contrasts. In the morning, men sweated under brutal heat, maintaining aircraft and reinforcing defenses. In the evening, they wrote letters home, played cards in Quonset huts, or stood quietly along the lagoon, watching the sun sink into the Pacific. Supplies arrived irregularly, bringing mail, fresh parts, and occasional luxuries. But isolation weighed heavily. The atoll was a narrow ring of sand surrounded by endless water. There was no city to escape to, no countryside to explore, only the perimeter of the runway and the sea. Medical challenges compounded the strain. Tropical humidity bred infection, mosquitoes carried disease, salt air corroded weapons and machinery, requiring constant cleaning.
Fresh water remained precious. Every gallon had to be collected, stored, or carefully rationed. The war here was fought not only against an enemy in the sky, but against climate and corrosion. Despite the tension, operations intensified. Bombers lifted off from Funafuti on long missions northward toward Japanese-held positions in the Gilbert Islands. Crews flew hours over open ocean, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial calculations. When they returned, if they returned, ground crews swarmed their aircraft, patching bullet holes, refueling tanks, rearming bomb bays. Each sortie tested the fragile infrastructure the Seabees had built. The psychological shift was profound. Funafuti was no longer a defensive outpost, it was an offensive platform. From its coral runway, American air power could now reach targets that had once seemed distant and secure. Japanese planners who had dismissed the atoll as insignificant were forced to reconsider. A small island had become a launchpad. Yet the cost was constant readiness. Radar teams worked through the night. Anti-aircraft gunners slept beside their weapons. Pilots briefed before dawn, studying weather reports and enemy intelligence. Every takeoff carried risk. A mechanical failure meant ditching in open ocean. A navigational error meant missing the atoll entirely on return. There were no alternate airfields nearby. Funafuti was both departure point and lifeline. As the weeks passed, the base proved its resilience. The runway absorbed landings and endured repairs. Fuel reserves grew. Defensive positions hardened. What had once been a vulnerable experiment was evolving into a hardened node in the Pacific war network. The Seabees' compressed coral and steel matting had withstood not only aircraft weight, but enemy bombs. The turning point came when bomber operations from Funafuti began contributing directly to the softening of Japanese defenses in the Gilberts. Reconnaissance photographs improved targeting accuracy. Repeated strikes disrupted supply lines and airfields. The atoll's role in shaping the coming offensive became undeniable. It was no longer simply surviving under threat, it was shaping events beyond its horizon. Still, no one on Funafuti mistook progress for safety. The island remained narrow, exposed, and within range of retaliation. Every sunrise brought the possibility of incoming aircraft. Every sunset carried the uncertainty of who might not return. In the vast Pacific, where battles were often defined by carriers and fleets, life on Funafuti revealed another dimension of warfare. Victory depended on fragile runways holding under pressure, on radar screens glowing through the night, on engineers and gunners standing their ground on a strip of coral barely wide enough to contain them. The atoll that once seemed irrelevant had become a forward blade aimed northward, and as bomber engines roared into the sky, Funafuti's transformation was complete. It was no longer just an island under threat, it was a weapon. Alive, operational, and impossible to ignore.
By late 1943, Funafuti was no longer fighting simply to survive. It was projecting power. The coral runway that had once seemed impossibly fragile now pulsed with operational rhythm. Engines roared at dawn. Bomb bays were loaded with precision. Crews gathered for briefings under dim lights, studying maps of Japanese-held islands to the north. The atoll had become a launch platform for a widening offensive. The strategic focus was clear: the Gilbert Islands. Chief among them was Tarawa, a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold bristling with coastal guns, airstrips, and entrenched defenders. To assault Tarawa directly without preparation would be costly. It needed to be softened, its airfields cratered, supply depots hit, defensive positions disrupted. That work would begin in the sky. From Funafuti, B-24 Liberators lifted off in long arcs over open ocean, flying hundreds of miles toward targets that only months earlier had been untouchable. Each mission demanded careful coordination. Weather patterns shifted rapidly across the Pacific. Cloud cover could obscure bomb runs.
Navigation over featureless water required discipline and precision. A miscalculation meant lost fuel, and lost fuel meant never returning to the narrow strip of steel and coral that awaited them. The runway crews understood the stakes. Before each departure, aircraft were inspected meticulously, engines tuned, hydraulics checked, bomb racks secured. Fuel tank farms constructed by Seabees now fed the growing tempo of operations. Drums and pipelines that had once seemed excessive were now barely enough. Ammunition dumps were replenished constantly. Funafuti was evolving into a logistical artery, feeding the offensive northward. The first sustained bombing missions against Japanese positions in the Gilberts sent a message. Japanese commanders had assumed their southern flank was secure, protected by distance and defensive depth. Now heavy bombers were appearing from an unexpected direction. Airfields were cratered, fuel stores ignited, communications were disrupted. Even when physical damage was limited, the psychological impact was profound. The perimeter was no longer sealed. Japanese forces attempted to respond. Intermittent air raids targeted Funafuti, hoping to cripple the base before it could fully support invasion operations. Anti-aircraft fire intensified. Camouflage improved. Aircraft were dispersed along the runway's edges, shielded by sandbag revetments. Repairs became routine, almost procedural. Bombs would fall. Coral would be filled. Steel matting would be relaid. The base adapted. As the assault on Tarawa drew closer, coordination expanded beyond air power alone. Naval vessels began using Funafuti's lagoon as a staging and refueling point. Transports and support ships anchored in its sheltered waters. Communications traffic increased dramatically as commanders synchronized airstrikes with amphibious planning. The atoll had become more than an airfield. It was a hub. In briefing tents, maps of Tarawa were marked with fresh reconnaissance data gathered by aircraft launched from Funafuti. Each mission refined the understanding of Japanese defenses. Gun emplantments were photographed, shoreline obstacles identified. The flow of intelligence tightened the noose. Bombing was no longer random, it was systematic preparation. For the men stationed on Funafuti, the transformation was visible. The once quiet lagoon now reflected silhouettes of ships. The sky, once empty, was threaded daily with contrails. Supplies arrived in greater quantities. The pace quickened. There was a growing sense that this small atoll was connected directly to something larger, something imminent. When the Battle of Tarawa began in November 1943, aircraft operating from bases like Funafuti played a crucial supporting role. Bombing runs targeted airfields and defensive positions, attempting to reduce the resistance awaiting U.S. Marines. Though the battle would still become one of the bloodiest engagements of the Pacific War, it unfolded in a context shaped in part by months of air operations staged from fragile coral runways to the south. The lesson was unmistakable. Control of isolated atolls could reshape entire campaigns. A base dismissed as insignificant had enabled sustained pressure on Japanese strongholds, forcing them to divert resources and defend in multiple directions. The island-hopping strategy was no longer theoretical, it was operational reality. Funafuti demonstrated the multiplier effect of engineering. Without its runway, bombers would have lacked range. Without its fuel reserves, missions would have been limited. Without its lagoon anchorage, naval coordination would have been slower and riskier. Steel matting and crushed coral had extended the reach of fleets and armies alike. And yet, for those who had built it, the work never truly ended. Aircraft returned damaged and needed immediate repair. Weather eroded surfaces. Defensive positions required reinforcement. The war was moving north, but Funafuti remained the critical link in the chain. From Tokyo's vantage point, the realization was sobering. The Pacific was not simply a barrier, it was a lattice of potential stepping stones. Each atoll, once transformed, became a springboard for the next assault. Funafuti had proven that no perimeter was beyond reach if engineers and air crews could extend the line forward. The coral strip that once seemed too narrow to matter was now part of a widening corridor of advance. Its bombers had struck, its lagoon had sheltered ships, its existence had altered calculations on both sides of the war. In the vastness of the Pacific, scale was deceptive. A small island could carry enormous consequence. And as operations pushed onward from the Gilberts towards the Marshalls and beyond, Funafuti stood as proof that the offensive was not driven by numbers alone, but by the ability to transform geography into power.
By the time the smoke cleared over Tarawa in November 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new and brutal clarity. The cost of assaulting fortified islands was undeniable. The lessons were written in sand and blood. But behind the headlines of infantry charges and naval bombardments stood a quieter truth. None of it would have been possible without the chain of forward bases stretching across the ocean, bases like Funafuti. The island-hopping strategy, later formalized under commanders like Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, depended on a simple but demanding principle. You did not attack everywhere. You bypassed some strongholds, isolated others, and seized positions that allowed you to move closer to Japan step by step. Each captured or fortified island became both shield and sword, defensive anchor and offensive springboard. Funafuti was one of the early proofs that this doctrine could work. What made it remarkable was not its size, but its transformation. In October 1942, it had no runway, no fuel reserves, no hardened defenses. By late 1943, it had supported sustained bomber operations, sheltered naval units, and helped pave the way for the Gilbert Islands campaign. It demonstrated that geography could be reshaped faster than the enemy could respond. The Seabees' role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Officially known as the U.S. Naval Construction Battalions, they were a unique experiment in military organization. Skilled civilian tradesmen given uniforms, rifles, and a mandate to build under fire. On Funafuti, they crushed coral into compacted aggregate, laid miles of steel matting, erected fuel tank farms, dug defensive positions, and repaired bomb damage often within hours. Their unofficial motto, "Can do," was not propaganda, it was operational necessity. The significance of Funafuti extended beyond a single campaign. Its success validated a larger approach to Pacific warfare. If one fragile atoll could be transformed into a functioning air and naval base, then others could too. Across the Central Pacific, similar efforts accelerated, in the Marshalls, the Marianas, and beyond. Coral runways multiplied, lagoons filled with ships. Airfields appeared on islands that had never before supported heavy aircraft. This expansion altered Japan's defensive calculations. Vast distances that once shielded its perimeter began to shrink. Every new base extended American reach. Long-range bombers could strike deeper. Naval forces could refuel and resupply closer to contested zones. Amphibious assaults could be staged with increasing precision. Funafuti also exposed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Logistics and engineering were as decisive as combat itself. Bombers could not fly without fuel. Marines could not land without preparatory air cover. Ships could not operate indefinitely without forward anchorages. Victory required infrastructure, and infrastructure required time, material, and relentless labor. On Funafuti, the environment itself was an adversary. Coral foundations shifted, tropical storms battered installations, salt air corroded steel.
Fresh water remained scarce, yet the base endured. Repairs became routine, maintenance became constant, adaptation became culture. As the Pacific Campaign advanced northward, Funafuti's direct role gradually diminished. Newer bases closer to Japan took precedence. The war moved on. But its early contribution remained embedded in the operational chain. Without those first stepping stones, later advances would have been slower, riskier, and perhaps costlier. The legacy of Funafuti was not in monuments or massive fortifications. It was in proof of concept. It showed that even the most unforgiving terrain could be engineered into strategic advantage. A coral atoll barely 400 meters wide had launched heavy bombers into contested skies. It had withstood air raids. It had supported fleets. In a war often remembered for aircraft carriers and amphibious landings, the quiet revolution of construction under fire reshaped the battlefield. Steel planking and crushed coral extended the reach of strategy. Survey stakes and bulldozers shifted the balance of power. By 1945, as American forces closed in on Japan itself, the cumulative effect of these forward bases was undeniable. Air power projected from island to island, tightening the arc around the home islands. The Pacific was no longer a protective moat for Japan. It had become a corridor. Funafuti's story reminds us that victory in World War II was not forged solely in dramatic clashes of fleets or heroic charges on beaches. It was forged in heat and dust, in the grinding of coral rock, in the laying of steel under threat of bombardment. It was built, quite literally, by hands that understood how to turn raw terrain into operational power. In the end, the core question that once hovered over that narrow strip of coral had been answered. How do you turn a 400-meter-wide atoll into a weapon of war? You bring engineers who refuse to see limits. You bring steel and fuel across thousands of miles of ocean. You defend what you build, and you repair it when it breaks. And piece by piece, runway by runway, you transform isolation into leverage. Funafuti was never meant to be famous. It was small, remote, and easily overlooked. But for a crucial moment in the Pacific War, it stood as proof that ingenuity could outmatch geography, and that sometimes the path to victory begins on the narrowest strip of land imaginable.